Hi everyone, this is Matthew Janda for Card Runners, and I'm here with a new series that I've been wanting to make for quite a while, which is going to be about how to utilize small bets. So outline for the series. So the first video is going to be an old school PowerPoint video explaining the theory behind small bets. So we're going to talk about why we bet small, why we bet big in different spots. We're going to talk about betting small in position versus betting small out of position. And we're going to talk about stack depth considerations for altering our bet sizing. The second video is going to emphasize Poker Snowy, and I'm going to try to illustrate a lot of spots where Poker Snowy likes to bet small and show you a pattern in that so you can extrapolate that to other situations. And then the third video, I'm going to try to emphasize PO Solver. So we're going to use two pretty advanced softwares in this series. And then for the fourth video, I'm just going to try to tie together any loose ends. So whatever I think is important to discuss that we didn't get to adequately address in the first three videos, that's going to come in the fourth video. I also want to tell you now that I think this is going to be a relatively difficult series. So I've actually tried making this series before and had to cancel it. So about 6 months ago, I wanted to make a small bet sizing theory series because I haven't been making nearly as much theory content as I used to, just because I don't think there's all that much new theory content to produce anymore. So I tried making this series, and then as I tried making it, I realized I didn't know it well enough to explain it, and I found out I was wrong on some stuff. So you can still be pretty new or just a relatively weak player, and I think gain a lot from this series, but know that some of the concepts are probably going to seem pretty tricky if you're not, if you haven't been playing for a couple years. And if something is unclear or you don't know some of the background information that you need for this series, you can totally just ask me in the forums and I'll be glad to help. So if something's not addressed here that you think you need to understand something that is in the slides, just let me know and I'll help you out. So to start off, we're going to get extreme because I think to better understand a concept, it's often best to start with extreme examples. So I'll make the concepts and the examples realistic in just a few moments, but when you're really trying to learn a concept, extreme examples I think very often help in poker. All right, so I feel like I've understood very big bets for a long time, but I've only recently really understood small bets. So we're going to work backwards and start with big bets, and then we're going to begin discussing small bets. All right, so when should you overbet? Hopefully most of the people watching this already know this, but if you don't, that's totally fine. But pause for a moment and explain to yourself when overbetting makes sense. I think it's fine if you do this however you want. You can do it by just imagining an example of a good overbet spot, or even better if you can conceptually explain when to overbet with your range or when to overbet with your hand, but pause and try to do this. All right, so overbetting in a nutshell, we're not going to spend too much time on this, is for your range, you're going to want to consider overbetting when your opponent's range is capped and yours is not. In other words, you can have several nut type hands in your range, but your opponent can have few or none. So it's okay if they can have a couple combinations of the nuts, but for the most part, you're really not going to consider overbetting unless your opponent's range is capped. And that's usually going to happen after you bet on a relatively wet board texture and then the turn or the river card came blank. So that's why you almost always see overbets on the turn and the river, and very, very rarely on the flop. Pre-flop going all in, that doesn't really count as an overbet. All right, answer for your specific hand. Your bets and raises should always deny equity and or make the pot bigger in case you win. So you overbet a hand when a big bet accomplishes this. And this usually requires little fear of you already being beat. So keep this in mind, regardless of how big or how small we bet, we're always going to be betting to deny equity and make the pot bigger in case we win. Doesn't matter if we're making a ginormous bet or if we're making a small bet. That's always why we bet. All right. And very strong and or very vulnerable hands which don't block the top of villain's range often make the best overbets. And sorry, this should say at least for value. If we have a strong hand, we don't want to block the top of our opponent's range because we want them to call. So very strong or very vulnerable hands which don't block the top of villain's range often make the best overbets when we're overbetting for value. If we're bluffing and we're overbetting, it's a little bit trickier. The removal effect gets a little more difficult, but usually the top of the opponent's range is going to be, a top pair hand. There's no real way to block top pair hands if we're bluffing because if we have top pair, it's not a bluff. So when we're value overbetting, we usually don't want to block the best hands in the opponent's range. And if we're bluffing, we can't really block the best hands in the opponent's range usually anyways, because that's probably going to be a top pair type hand. Not always, but probably. Okay, so we're going to just power through an overbet example. You open the button with pocket tens, the big blind calls, and the flop comes at 9 high with a flush draw. Villain checks, you bet, he calls, turns to the 3 of diamonds. So the first thing you should immediately notice on this 3 of diamonds turn is the big blind's range is pretty much going to be capped because he would have raised all his sets in 2 pair on the flop most likely. So because villain's range is capped at ace 9 with trace amounts of 2 pair, so he might have a couple of those 2 pair combos that we listed. I think you should have most of them, but it does depend on your pre-flop opening size. There's going to be very few hands in villain's range that beat an overpair here, namely pocket tens. So we bet big here. The hand's strong and the hand's vulnerable, and the only way to build the pot is to make large bets ourselves because our opponent's not going to raise. So very typical spot of where you can overbet. It doesn't need to be the biggest overbet ever. I'm not saying to bet 3 times the pot, but here I would, if I was going to play this hand 10 minutes from now, I'd probably be at least betting close to pot on the turn, maybe even a little bit bigger. So I think this concept's actually pretty easy. It's not really intuitive in the sense that most people will figure it out on their own. But once people explain it to you, you're probably not going to have a very hard time understanding when overbetting makes sense. You overbet when the opponent can't be strong. Relatively simple enough. This is very different from betting small, which is not intuitive, not simple, and even once it's explained, I think it's pretty hard to implement. All right, so as I just mentioned, it's pretty simple to explain when an overbet makes sense conceptually. And if you haven't done that before, like if you really just sort of got introduced to overbetting, you should pause and then now explain once again when an overbet makes sense. So that way it will be more solidified in your memory and you'll be able to implement it better. Okay, but now try to explain when a small bet makes sense conceptually. So try to explain when it makes sense conceptually to bet 1/6 of the pot. All right, ready? Go. So pause and explain conceptually when a 1/6 pot size bet would be best. It's really hard, right? Like, it's not even something that I feel like I understand it pretty well at this point, and it's not something I could do quickly. So this is one of those things where I really like it when I can explain something like in a simple and clear way, but I don't even think it's doable for this concept. Some concepts just aren't really that simple, and I think this is one of them. So as previously mentioned, no matter how big we bet, our bet should always be designed to make the pot bigger in case we win and deny equity. All bets should do this, pretty much no exceptions. With a small bet, we should expect to deny very little equity, but make the pot slightly bigger on average than we would by checking. When we're out of position, there is no practical difference between betting very small and checking. In other words, if the pot is $100 on the turn and we're out of position, there is no practical difference between betting $1 or checking. So I have talked about this in other videos, out of position betting small, which is the easier concept to understand. In position betting small is more difficult. So when you're out of position, checking is just not any different from betting 0 because you're not reopening up the betting. So if there's a $100 pot, like actually imagine there's a $100 pot and you're on the turn. What's the difference if you check or if you bet $1? There's none. And people always get weirded out when they bet small out of position because they go, well, if I bet small out of position, I don't know what to do if I face a raise. Right. Well, I don't usually know what to do if I check and I'm out of position and I face a bet and I have a medium strength hand. Right? You're not really getting, there's no real way to avoid the sticky situation of having a medium strength hand when you're out of position. If you check and face a bet, it sucks. If you bet $1 into a $100 pot and he raises, it sucks. If you bet $10 into a $100 pot and he raises, it sucks. Plain medium strength hands out of position is just a bad situation to be in, and there's no real way to avoid that. And the last thing you want to do is just make large or medium-sized bets when you're out of position with a medium strength hand because it's easy, because that's a very inefficient way to play the hand. All right, so a small bet out of position makes sense when a 5 or 10 or $20 bet into a $100 pot denies equity and or makes the pot bigger in a more effective way than a $0 bet does. Pause for a moment and try to come up with an example or conceptualize when a $10 bet into a $100 pot is going to be better than a check or a $0 bet into a $100 pot. And seriously, mad props if you can figure this out and you haven't seen it or thought about it before, because I don't think it's intuitive at all. So pause for a moment and think and try to do it. All right. So this would likely happen when we have a range that has more equity than the opponent's, but our range is capped. So in other words, our range has more equity. The average hand strength in our range is higher than our opponent's, but the distribution of that equity is bad in the sense that we don't really have any really good hands. So another way to look at it would be like, imagine if our opponent has lots of top pair and bottom pair hands, whereas we had lots of medium pair or middle pair hands. If that's the case, we could have more equity than our opponent. Like, maybe our opponent's range is 30% top pair hands and 70% bottom pair hands. And our range is 100% medium pairs. If that's the case, it can be possible that a really small bet is actually more effective than checking. So it depends on exactly, how many top pair hands your opponent has compared to how many bottom pair hands, what street we're on, stack depth, all that jazz matters. But at least, and pause for a moment if you need to, but at least try to think about how that could make sense. It can make sense where we go, okay. So overall, the average hand in our range is stronger than our opponent's, so that makes us want to bet, but our range is so capped relative to our opponent's that we're restricted on the bet sizing we can make, because every time our opponent raises, we effectively have a bluff catcher, so that makes us have to bet small. Again, we're just conceptualizing it right now. We're not doing examples yet. That's probably going to mostly happen in the next 2 videos, but make sure you're at least seeing how that can make sense when we're out of position, because again, I think in position is actually a little harder than this part. All right, so pause if you need to. And yeah, so this is just saying what I just said. We can have 60% equity out of position, but no nut type hands, so a small bet could be a little bit more effective than a 0 bet. So that paragraph's just me repeating what I kind of already said. We can't bet big because every time we face a raise, we have a bluff catcher, so we want to bet small. But the small bet can be better at denying a teeny weeny bit of equity and making the pot just a teeny bit bigger on average than checking does. And overall, that can have a higher EV, even if we have a really capped range. Okay, so hopefully everything's clear at this point. If not, take a breather, maybe rewatch the last 5 minutes, and just make sure you got it. And then do note, for this out of position stuff, I actually understood it before Applications was published, so the 2+2 book, but it's probably not all that practical, especially not before Poker Snowy and PO Solver came out. I think it really wasn't all that practical. If you were really sick, you could use it to gain a little bit of EV with like Card Runner's EV, but I think the more powerful and easier software is really helpful for this. So this has been known about for a while, but it's not really all that practical or all that important. If you check rather than bet 10% of the pot, unless you're just like some high stakes sicko, who cares, right? We're all going to make way more mistakes than, betting 0 when we should have been betting 10%. So not a big deal. It's not like over betting where it's really important. But there was definitely some stuff I had wrong when writing Applications. And I think this is actually the more practical stuff. So that's what I want to talk about in the sort of second half or last third of this video, is what I had wrong before and how we can use new information to hopefully increase our EV when we're playing in position and we want to make small bets. So here's what I had wrong when writing Applications. I thought small bets in position would be pretty unlikely to happen. My thoughts were, why reopen up the betting with a small bet when we're in position? It doesn't put much more money into the pot and can result in us facing a check raise, which is impossible when we're out of position. I think that logic seems pretty good, right? And for what it's worth, this is true. There's just other stuff going on as well. But make sure that this makes sense to you. When we're out of position, yeah, maybe betting 10% has a super slightly higher EV than betting 0%. But when we're in position, do we really want to bet 10% and let our opponent check raise us? Especially if we're on the flop. We're adding another street to the game. And if we have a lot of stacked up, that can be really bad when we're facing a polarized range. So again, for that reason, I thought we really won't bet small in position. But it doesn't seem like that's totally true. Okay, so here are what I think were the missing details. And some of this was known, but not in as much detail as I feel like it's known now. And again, Poker Snowy and PO Solver have been really helpful for sort of analyzing this. So being out of position sucks, especially at small stack depths where you're encouraged to play a raise or fold game when out of position because that destroys the bettor's positional advantage. So what's the counter strategy to this check raise or check fold strategy? So again, this has been known for kind of a while, but think about this. If your opponent's planning to either check raise or check fold, and especially in old poker books, and I assume old videos too, you'll see people advocate that strategy on boards where it's really hard to check call. So if it's really hard to check call on a certain board texture, what should the in-position player do with his bet sizing? Pause for a moment and think. You keep betting smaller and smaller until the out-of-position player is forced to develop a calling range. So a good example of this would be if on a given flop, you're planning to either check raise or check fold on, let's say, a 6 of hearts, 5 of hearts, 2 of clubs flop, right? 6 of hearts, 5 of hearts, 2 of clubs flops are very hard to play out of position. So if you're planning on check raising or check folding against a half pot size bet, the in position player should keep betting smaller and smaller and smaller until it forces you to call out of position and play the turn with a weak range on a board texture where position is exceptionally valuable. So the just jam or fold strategy doesn't really come into play all that much when you're in position because you're throwing away your positional advantage when you're when you're jamming. So that's another common mistake I've seen tournament players make, where when you're out of position and you have shallow stacked up, sure, you can totally just check raise or check fold. But when you're in position and you have shallow stacked up, do you really want to just jam or fold? Sometimes jamming can be fine when you're in position. You're supposed to get very aggressive as stacks get smaller and smaller. You're supposed to raise more. But every time you raise when you're in position, you're throwing away your positional advantage. So a mistake people often make is they don't like calling when they're shallow and they're in position because they're used to just wanting to go all in so much with shallow stacked up. And if you play around with Poker Snowy or PO Solver, you'll see it's actually very much so correct to call, even when you only have a tiny bit of stacked up left when you're in position. Sometimes the raise doesn't make the pot bigger in case we win or deny equity all that effectively. So you are supposed to call when you're in position, even when you have the shallow stack depth. Out of position, it's less common because by jamming, you destroy the positional advantage of your opponent. All right, so again, it's more common to have a check raise or check fold strategy than it is to have a jam or fold strategy when you're in position. So I just mentioned it, but it got its own slide as point number 2. As stacks get shallower, the jam or fold game, when out of position, becomes much easier to play and theoretically sound. And again, even in position, you will jam more often as stacks get shallower and shallower. A really good example of this would be for 100 big blind stacks, you would never really raise top pair medium kicker, or at least not all that often on the flop. Whereas as stacks get shallower, you can start raising, top pair more aggressively. As stacks get shallower, still, you can start raising middle pair more aggressively. And if stacks are just crazy shallow, then everyone's just jamming all their pairs on the flop. So you do get a lot more aggressive the shallower you get, but especially out of position, you want to raise a lot to destroy positional advantage. Just like out of position, you will find yourself in position with a range that has more equity but is capped. It makes sense to bet small with this range. So we kind of already talked about this for out of position play, but a good example of that would be is let's say I open in the button and the big blind calls, the flop comes something wet, the big blind checks like he always does, I bet half the pot, villain check raises relatively large and I call. The turn is the 3 of hearts and villain checks again. So if on this flop, let's say we were 100 big blinds deep, Villain's probably check raising a pretty polarized range. It's not really going to be very efficient for the opponent to check raise a7 on that flop, because even though check raising a7 will deny equity and will make the pot bigger in case he wins reasonably well, the problem is on that flop, a lot of the hands that I call with have so much equity against ace7. In other words, there's just so much draw on this flop and I have position that even the hands that ace7's beating, I'm going to outdraw him with all the time. So that board's kind of too wet for the opponent to check raise a7 all that well there. Whereas a7 would make a better check raise probably on like a 7-4-2 rainbow board. So yeah, on that board it's too wet. So when he check raises me there, and then the turn's a 3 of hearts, and he checks to me on the turn, which I assume is the next thing. All right, so what is the equity? So pause if you need to talk about equity distributions. But, yeah, big blind check raising range is much more polarized than my flop calling range. Okay, sorry, I didn't see that. I already wrote it right here. The turn's the 3 of hearts, and villain checks again. Okay, so on this turn, villain's going to have a polarized range here, because everything he check raised with on the flop was probably pretty polarized. So it was going to be really strong hands, bluffs that missed, and draws that missed. So on this turn, when he checks to me, what bet sizing makes sense? I have the stronger range, and my range is capped, so I'm going to want to bet relatively small here, right? I want my opponent to either fold his hands, so, I want to deny him the ability to realize his equity, and then if he does go for the double check raise, I want to make it as inefficient as possible. And the way I do that is by betting small. So, like on the turn here, my default line here, for example, like let's say on this turn I had any pair of 7s or pocket 8s or pocket 9s, I'd probably bet this turn against an unknown, but I'd bet it relatively small. Make him either go for the double check raise now, or make him kind of find himself in like an awkward spot where it's like, maybe he was check raising on the flop with king 10 of diamonds. Okay, cool, either fold it or call and be behind. So that's why I would bet small on this turn. For what it's worth, I think this is actually going to occur pretty often, and it's going to be a pretty good reason to bet small in position, especially on the turn and river. Okay, reason number 4. Sometimes you'll just have a hand that still denies some relevant equity by betting small, but can't afford to make the opponent's range much stronger by betting big. So the highest EV bet is often around a quarter pot size bet, at least according to Poker Snowy. So we're going to do Poker Snowy and PO Solver in this series. PO Solver is going to be more precise, whereas Poker Snowy is better at utilizing multiple bet sizes because my computer isn't able to solve situations with as many bet sizes as Poker Snowy uses. So they each have their pros and cons, and we're going to use both. And my computer has a lot of RAM. It's just Poker Snowy right now is using 4 bet sizes on each street. I can't run those simulations in PO Solver. Okay, so let's do an example. And again, we're just talking concepts here, so just focus on the concept. So you open the button and find yourself on the flop with a weak pair, say a pair of 6s or lower. So we open the button and the big blind called, and we have a pair of 6s or lower. Maybe a quarter pot size bet denies some equity, since if we bet pocket 3s on the flop, any hand that folds is almost always going to have 2 overcards, while it still keeps the opponent's range weak enough that he's going to have to call with some ace-x hands, and we might actually get to showdown against those hands, and then we'll win with the pocket 3s. So a quarter pot size bet could be more plus EV than checking or betting a half pot size bet in a situation like that. So again, just focus on the concepts here. But sometimes, like you can imagine, the bigger we bet, the more we're going to make our opponent fold. If we have deuces on the flop, maybe a really small bet makes him still call with some ace-high hands that we beat, yet he still folds lots of, if the board's queen 7-2, he's still going to fold jack 6, probably. Oh, sorry, we have a set if it's queen 7-2. If the flop's queen 7-3 and we bet a pair of 3s, like 3x, there might be a bet sizing that makes our opponent fold jack 5 that had 2 overcards, and if we bet small enough, he might still call with some ace-high hands, and then even if we are behind, we have some redraw to, 2 parent trips and to outdraw him. So there probably are going to be some bet sizes that are smaller than a half pot size bet that work best for our specific hand on the flop, and with those hands, we're going to want to consider making a quarter pot size bet. And now we're at the final reason, which I actually think is the most important one and the one I think I missed the most, which is you can abuse your opponent horribly on the next street if he calls a quarter pot size bet on a wet board and the turn is a blank. So how do the ranges look in the following situations? So think about this for a minute. Button opens, big blind calls, the flop is 9-7-5, so an extremely wet flop. If the button checks and we check back and the turn's a 2 of hearts, how does each range look? Whose range is stronger? The big blind range or our checking back range? What's he likely going to do on a blank turn? What bet sizes are going to be reasonable for him? Really think about how both ranges will look there if the flop went check-check on a wet board. Likewise, imagine we bet a quarter pot size bet on the button and the big blind calls and the turn is the 2 of hearts. How do both ranges look? Pause for a moment and think, and then we're going to talk about it. Okay, so if the flop goes check-check, our opponent can totally be checking strong hands on the flop there because he's planning on check raising his really good hands or check calling his pretty good hands, right? Our range is much stronger than our opponent's when we're on the button and the flop comes 9-7-5. So the highest EV line for all of his strong hands is for him to check raise. When the flop goes check-check, he could have been strong and his check raise could have failed, so he could still easily be strong on the 2 of hearts turn. So if the flop goes check-check, our opponent should use all sorts of bet sizes on the turn. Maybe he wants to overbet with some of his good and vulnerable hands. Maybe he wants to bet smaller with hands that are like 7x or 5x because, a smaller bet with 5x still denies some equity and makes the pot bigger in case he wins. So he's going to use all sorts of different bet sizes there. He's going to be value betting. He's going to be bluffing, all that jazz. He's going to know we can't be strong on that 2 of heart turn unless we turn to set with pocket twos or turn some crazy 2 pair. So if we check back this flop, we're going to be in for a world of hurt on a lot of turn cards because he's going to know our range is so capped. Now imagine if rather than checking on the flop, we decided to make a quarter pot size bet. So we did what I thought was going to be bad, right? We reopened up the betting for only just a teeny weeny bet. But if we bet that small and our opponent calls, now what do the ranges look like on the turn? If our opponent check called a quarter pot size bet on a flop this wet, can he be strong on the 2 of heart turn? Well, unless he turned one of the few hands that improves on the 2 of hearts turn, the answer is going to be no, right? He would have check raised all of his strong hands on the flop. All of his 2 pair, all of his straights, all of his sets, he's going to check raise those hands. Yet, he just called. So we know he can't really be strong when the turn blanks. And even if the turn wasn't this blank, we'd still know he has a relatively weak range if he just called a bet that small. So what that lets us do is really abuse him on the next street. So what you see happen a lot, just to a greater magnitude than I expected. We've been talking about for a long time in other videos how we might bet the flop like a half pot size bet and then we might overbet the turn if we get a blank. Well, we might even be able to do a more extreme version of that, where we can bet even smaller on the flop in some spots with some hands. We make a quarter pot size bet, and then when the turn comes, we know our opponent's range is very weak relative to ours, especially if the turn blanked, and now we can bet bigger. Not always going to be an overbet, but, maybe we can bet 80% of the pot or 75% of the pot. So here, it depends on what hands we're holding, but it's reasonable on this flop to at least imagine there might be some hands that want to bet small because when the opponent calls, we're going to be able to really sort of abuse him on the next street because we know he has a weak range. And again, we're going to get into specific boards and specific hands in the next couple of videos. I really just care about the concept here. And the main concept for this slide to take home is, wow, if I check back on the 9-7-5 board with a flush draw in position, my opponent is going to just know I can't be strong on the turn and he's going to light me up if we're good. But if I bet small on the flop instead and my opponent calls, now I'm going to know he's unlikely to be strong and I can light him up on the turn. So this small bet's very efficient for letting you bluff more effectively later and get to see turn and rivers later because you'll have the opportunity to check back the turn if you want after betting the flop small. Whereas if you just check back the flop, your opponent would very likely bet the turn. Doesn't mean we're always going to bet small. Doesn't mean betting small is always better than checking. But again, this is, I think, what I really missed a while ago. And it kind of opens up a whole new world for making some small bets that are going to be a little more profitable than checking or betting a half pot size bet. Summary. So, while the situations where betting small is best aren't usually as clear cut as when betting big is best, hopefully you can see it makes sense in many situations. Again, there were a lot of different examples and different reasons to bet small, whereas for overbetting, it was pretty straightforward. Overbetting, he's just capped, we nuke it. Whereas betting small is a little more complex, or a lot more complex. Usually the gap in EV between betting small and checking, or betting small and betting 1/2 pot, will be small, but not always. So I actually have found some spots where it seems like there's a pretty big EV gap between checking or making a quarter pot size bet, or betting a half pot size bet, or betting a quarter pot size bet. We'll talk about those in future videos, but normally the EV gap is going to be relatively small. But the better and better you get, the more you're going to care about acquiring that small increase in EV. And then also just keep in mind, optimal poker probably plays tons of mixed strategies, so there's probably lots of hands that, will check sometimes and bet a quarter pot size bet and bet half pot size bet sometimes. There's many mixed strategies, but there will be an EV gap a lot of the time. And then lastly, especially in practice, the EV of betting a quarter pot size bet may be substantially higher than checking or betting a half pot size bet in many situations. This is probably going to be even more true as stacks get shallow, but the last slide that I just talked about, betting small now and having the opponent call where he's really just announced he can't be strong, I think it's going to be a very powerful exploitative tool. And I think even though overbetting is very important theoretically, it's still going to be most powerful as an exploitative tool. I think that's going to especially be the case for betting small. And you're often going to use betting small and overbetting together, right? You bet small now, maybe on the flop or on the turn, and then you overbet the next street. So just know, even if we do look at PO Solver and Poker Stone and we see lots of small EV gaps and lots of mixed strategies, that doesn't mean in reality the EV gap is going to be small. Like a lot of opponents, the small bet probably will be substantially better than making a half pot size bet or checking. All right, guys. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. Poker Snowy is next. Yeah, and if anything is unclear or if you do need a little more background, just ask me in the forums and I'll be glad to help. Good luck, everyone. Take care.